Welcome to the second episode of JAA 708, King Alfred's Leyland Olympic. In the first episodes, we looked at the original history of the vehicle, its time in Winchester, and then how it was sold for further service in Ireland before, after many years, being rescued by the Friends of King Alfred buses and brought back to Winchester. Now we're going to look at what happened next.
My account of 708 goes back over 70 years, right back to 1951, when I was a small kid in short trousers. 708 was our school bus on occasions, from Winchester to the outlying villages, and my village was Sparsholt. I was very excited seeing this bus. It was revolutionary design, very state of the art at its time. It was a single-decker bus with entrance and exit at the front, an underfloor engine, and it was revolutionary in its day, and it was a forerunner for the next 40 to 50 years of single-decker bus design. We had it on the school run mainly in the afternoons. Later on in life it settled down to its regular route in Winchester. That was route number 4 to Stanmore Estate, and it stayed there for 90%, must have been 90% of its life. In 1960 I moved away from Winchester, so I lost account of what was really happening there. But on occasions I'd come back to Winchester and I'd see 708 in the street with all the other King Alfred buses. That was during the 60s and 70s. And then I came back to Winchester in the beginning of the 80s, and we had a regular coach driver by the name of Royston De Nira. And he pointed out to me that 708 had gone to Ireland and it had caught fire. So we thought, oh dear, it's destroyed. But subsequent years, we found that it was still extant, and there was various communications that we might be able to actually retrieve it back to this country. Anyway, negotiations took place, and a group of us from FOCAB went out to Ireland to view it. And on seeing it, I thought, oh dear, it was an absolutely in a moribund state, a terrible state, with bushes and trees growing through it. And I said, walk away. They said, no, hang on a minute, we can do something with this. And I'm jolly glad we did.
This was a Leyland Olympic, very early underfloor engine vehicle, named for the Olympic Games, which were held in London 1948. Here's our name, Leyland Olympic, and
there were only 19 of them ever built.
That's, yes.
Before they enlarged the spec.
Yes, they made the bus
and they made
bigger,
a lot more.
fatter.
44s, these are 40 seats.
And indeed the Olympic went on being built as an export model right the way through into the 1970s, so not an unsuccessful model in its context. But the badge, I think, does illustrate this unusual name, because until then Leyland had always used big cats.
No, but the double-deckers were not cats.
No, that's true.
Single-deckers were cats.
Yes.
That is not actually the original. We've got the original in the archive, and that's a casting of the original, which was made long before the bus was restored. I don't know who made it, and I painted it. And it's just at that time there was a bit of a danger that things like that might get stolen, and we didn't want the original to get stolen. So
having these Greek names caused a problem when they were selling Olympics to Turkey. They had to rename them something completely different. The idea of selling a vehicle with a Greek name to the Turks was out completely, so they renamed it something completely different.
Well, Keith started first, and he came back and kept telling me what he'd been doing and things. The first time he went, he moved one bolt, and I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. It gradually got to be the situation that I was doing a bit. I don't like watching other people. I'm quite good at doing things myself. So that's how it started for me.
Well, I'm Keith Andrews.
I'm Ruth Andrews.
Ruth's husband, yes, as you might have deduced. As a youngster, I'd always been interested in buses. Of course, that all dropped off when you get married and moved and have children, all that sort of thing, and then moved to Winchester. It was only when I first saw the buses driving around before running days that I showed an interest, and then went down. I dragged Ruth and the two young children at that stage down to the famous running day with the repair of 591 to go on a couple of rides, and it sort of, then I thought I'd better join, and then, as I think I heard Ruth saying earlier, after a bit I thought I'd better come and do some work and take out this famous bolt.
I was at a committee meeting. I was the minutes secretary for a long time, and they were all looking at this bus, and it had some money spent on it by Hampshire County Council, and they were thinking, right, now that's happened, we've got to get a move on and start looking as if we're doing something with it. And somebody, I think it was John Newton, said, well, who's going to be in charge of it? And they all sat there and didn't respond, so in the end I got fed up and said, oh, I'll do it. And I was quite surprised when they all said, oh, that's a brilliant idea.
I'm Bob Smith. I was involved in some of the early days, engineering, repair-wise, and then later on Ruth and Keith brought me in to help with engineering, welding and general mechanical repairs and restoration.
My name is Norman Aish. I didn't get involved until very early 2010 when I happened to go into the old Central Works, which is in the old bus station in Winchester, and very inquisitively saw this amazing vehicle which I didn't even realise existed. And I was fascinated by it, and sort of Ruth sort of came forward and introduced herself, and I was hooked, as they say.
When it came back from Ireland, one of our members, Chris Kent, spent a long time taking it to pieces and labelling all the parts and preparing it to be worked on.
Eventually we got it back to this country in 1990 it was, and it was towed by a transit, conveyed on the Rosslare Fishguard ferry. We eventually got it back to Hampshire. It was parked a mile away from where I live now, and it stayed there for the best part of 10 years. I did quite a bit of work on it during that period of 10 years before we started the really in earnest restoration. We started the restoration, I think it was about year 2000, and it took us 10 to 12 years to do. We were very, very lucky in obtaining a disused bus garage at Winchester, right in the centre of Winchester, owned by Stagecoach. They very kindly let us have the loan of it, with all the facilities there, with pits and the rest of the facilities there. So over the 10 or 12 years we worked intensively on this vehicle, spent a tremendous amount of money and hundreds of hours. I was involved mainly with the chassis, with the working mechanicals.
I could add it up for you if you really want to know. I actually kept a record of how many hours people were working on it. And I've just bothered to go through the first 2 years from 2007 to 2009, and there were 13 people working on it very regularly, and then extra people coming in as we needed expertise in various things. But it was a team effort, so at any one time different people were working on different parts of it simultaneously, but we all knew that what they were doing wasn't going to conflict with what somebody else was doing. So for instance, we didn't put the floor in until we were quite positive that we'd sorted out everything to do with any of the underfloor systems, which I think is quite unusual in bus restoration. You don't usually have to that sort of
Foresight.
this is important. All these rivets are modern pot rivets which have had the inside of the hole filled in and smoothed off. And I went round the whole of the bus and did every single one of those.
How many of them do you think there are?
I don't know, never counted, but it's an awful lot. It took a very long
Pushing
time.
1,000, I would say.
And there's at least one there that I missed.
As supplied, of course, the bus would not have had flashing trafficators like this. And we fitted them because in today's traffic, that's what people expect to see. What it would have had is these. We've got these and fitted them. What you're not allowed to have is both these working and this working when you're on the road. So we do have a switch where we can, when we're on a rally field or something, we can turn these on, which James will work out where the switch is in a minute or two, or hour or something.
Semaphores.
Yeah?
Right. So I can turn them on.
Yep, there you
Yeah,
go.
there you go.
Again. Is there any light in?
Yes, it's
Yes.
red, but I think you can't see.
Is it at the front or at the back? Well, so you can see.
No, it's translucent.
On the near side, on the other side, Alex.
Okay. So let's look on the other side. Once again. Okay. Sure.
It just has a nice red glow to it, sort of orange red. Or perhaps it's just street lights that it reflects in them. The
Does
material
it
is...
blink?
No.
No,
No,
they
it never
don't.
would have blinked.
And it doesn't go up and down like Paris buses.
Neither.
Oh, I see.
No, it just come out like that with a light in it. That's what they had.
So it's
That's-
used as an indicator.
Yes, instead because bus had no indicators. It was very ahead of its time at the time.
There is an interesting thing displayed here, but go back up. This bus is 24 volts, whereas an awful lot of early buses were only 12 volts. So when we were doing the electrics, we had to take that into account.
Another interesting challenge was getting the registration back because it had lost its original registration, JAA 708, and had been re-registered in Ireland as BIC 671, if I remember rightly. That was interesting paper and academic exercise, getting all sorts of bits of paper and going to the record office. We had the registration document for Ireland, and there were various negotiations with DVLA in Swansea, who were actually quite helpful in a way, and then we had to get an expert to examine it and say, oh, this was the bus. And indeed it was. So a great whoop of joy when they actually sent me the piece of paper saying, thank you, we've granted you the original registration.
We were fairly sure we had got the right bus because we'd found used tickets down the back of some of the seats.
And on a subsequent occasion when Stephen Morris was visiting, doing one of his regular reports about it for the Bus and Coach Preservation magazine, another of our people, Melvin Lovelock, who did lots and lots of work on the bus, particularly woodwork and so on, was scraping off the rear door, revealing what was then clearly the original advert, which features in old pictures of the bus when it was running in service. So we really did know we had the right bus. One or two.
There's one preserved on the Isle of
Man.
But I don't think they use it, although I think they could.
Yeah, I'm not sure there are any else still of,
No.
of that model, of the HR40 model. The only one we know of that's the same model of ours that still exists is in the Isle of Man Museum.
Stand clear of the doors, please. And so the thing about this, the cab of this vehicle is that in common with everything around the front of it, it's very confined. It's narrow, the dimensions are small. The way that the controls are laid out means that for a driver a certain amount of athleticism is required to even get into the driver's seat, because between you and your destination is the gear lever and the handbrake, which when applied is up here. When it's not applied, it's right out of the way, but you can't have it like that, otherwise the bus is rolling away when you get it. So to get in, you have to climb over both of those, and then you're in position, ready to go. And so that the passengers don't pat you on the shoulder as they get off, there's a thing there that you close so that the driver's cab is set up. You have a nice big Leyland steering wheel, quite horizontal in plane, and 2 pedals on the right and 1 on the left. So the throttle and the brake. Now the brake is, as has already been mentioned, this vehicle started life with a vacuum and switched to an air brake, and I think the pedal got changed at some point as well. So this is not an original arrangement, I don't think. So that's different. Whereas the clutch pedal is quite conventional and normal and what you'd expect. So to start the bus is a simple question: is it in gear? Is the handbrake on? Turn on the electrics and let's see if it goes. So it does. Now it's not as difficult as getting up into the cab of a half cab, but it's not easy either.
And that control panel is a replacement. It's the old one was completely knackered.
Well, yes, but it is an antique panel.
It is an antique panel.
It's just never got used.
And it's not the right one, but it does the job. And Pete Staples spent a long time wiring it all up. Pete Staples did all the wiring there. I ran most of the cables underneath, just running them. I'm not an electrician, but I can run cables. As was said, there was no floor when we started all this. We did then, of course, needed a new floor with some nice new wood that somebody whose name escapes me at the moment, but is on the list somewhere, did the floor. And then, of course, guess who did the tread strips? Yes, me. I'm tread strip expert. Although once again, we dragged my son Michael along to help. He was 39 when we did these floor strips.
These strips were
Yeah.
done by him.
Well, and me, and Ruth.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Of course, you have to clean them. These are the original strips, or various, or similar, all ever so rusty and bent, right? So you have to clean them and blast them and paint them with hammerite to bring them back to something like reasonable.
Because as we all said, it's 7'6" wide, 40 seats squeezed in was pretty snug,
Right.
wasn't it?
It was.
The driver, as well, as I found, was very snugly ensconced in his cab with very little room to move.
And the conductor.
Yes,
It was
yes.
hard work conducting,
Yeah.
because there was no handrails.
No.
And I have very good brakes, as I discovered on the first day out I was conducting it. When somebody walked out in front of the bus, Colin got him and put his foot on the brake, and I was finished up lying in the gangway, right?
Yeah. Of course, originally it didn't have good brakes because it was returned to it vacuum brakes as
Yes,
it came out of the
that's right.
factory. It was very quickly returned to Leyland's factory and converted to air brakes. The vacuum brakes obviously weren't up to scratch on the hills in Winchester. And the air brakes were somewhat cobbled together, as we found when we tried to
Yes.
rebuild it.
Well, we were very puzzled because there were all these bits they'd left some of the vacuum
They
parts
had,
there,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So trying to understand what the brakes were doing.
Yeah, we thought, well, what's these bits for? They don't fit anything. And then we gradually worked out that no, they were obsolete because it had been converted. So yeah, it was a bit of a early makeshift, as Leyland was obviously designing this new concept of underfloor engine and modern type of vehicle. It originally had this thing where every so often it would boil over. It would pump the water out of the radiator and would boil over. And the best engineering brains did various things to it, cleaned the system. And in the end, they even had the cylinder heads off the engine and overhauled them and put it back together. And it drove reasonably well. But still, it was showing up still that it had an engine fault. And as I say, I think that was why the engineering team decided that they put it over to Penton through the Christmas period while we had the running day, and when we'd finished that in January, when we had a bit more time, we'd bring the vehicle back, and then we'd once again have another look at the engine and see if we could find out why it still was not performing properly. But sadly, while it was there, with its tail between its legs, that's when it was overcome by the fire.
When I lost sleep over that night, I was in a heck of a state. I contacted them first thing the next morning. Unfortunately, the King Alfred buses were okay. The only bus we had lost was 708, which was bad enough from my point of view.
And we are today in some state of shock because we have lost one of our most valuable members in the form of our Olympic 708, which I remember as a small child back in the 50s, 60s. I think I might even have started it on a Christmas morning when we had to delay Christmas lunch to go down to the bus garage to make sure all the buses didn't go cold, because it was the only day of the year that they weren't running. So happy memories and busy memories. And our sympathies on behalf of the Chisnell family really go to the friends of King Alfred Buses, to James and his 200 members, and particularly all those who have been involved in keeping the charity going almost as long as the family business, now almost 50 years. Quite incredible, quite unique, I would suggest, in the United Kingdom. And we now have a big challenge, how to revive the memory of 708. That devastating fire, which I've heard evidence from James and others of, and of course seen the news on TV and so on, whipped through all those sheds. And of all the buses that were in the bus shed, I gather that the Olympic 708 was the only one that was still recognizable as a bus. Now that to me suggests that somebody is trying to tell us something, and I hope, for everyone's sake, that it is please save me and get me back on the road somehow. It will take time, it will take a lot of money, I've no doubt, but the will is there, and the people who restored it every 12 years, I think, between 2001 and 2012, they deserve to be supported, because they spent thousands of hours rebuilding that bus and bringing it back to life, having found it in a field in Ireland. It's quite an amazing story. And this book, which is such a well-written book, tells the history of the restoration, part one. Now I'm saying to myself, we need a restoration part two, and we're going to need a lot of help. But the spirit of King Alfred is there, and we're going to ask the local community please to support us, because this charity has done so much to preserve the icon which was King Alfred Motor Services all those years.
We produced a book, or more accurately, Ray Stenning of Best Impressions produced a book called, as you see here, The Return of the Olympic. It was largely based on articles that Stephen Morris wrote for Bus and Coach Preservation about once every 3 to 4 months, as he used to come down and visit us doing our work, and so he'd write up the articles, and then the book was based on this, was obviously some added history and so on. And this will give you much more details about the restoration and about the bus. And it's available from our website, which you should see on the screen, and it's also will be available at our New Year running day on January the 1st in Winchester, running the old King Alfred routes around Winchester, based in the Broadway, from about 9:30 to about 4:30.
So, our Leyland Olympic, JAA 708, an iconic vehicle built in 1950, 15 years in service, running to Stanmore for the King Alfred Motor Services. And that would be the moment for it to retire, but it was sold to Ireland. It did a further phase as a school bus in the middle of Ireland, County Wicklow, and then it was put aside by Jimmy Glynn, its then owner, expecting no more to happen to it than for it to rot away. He bargained without us in the Friends of King Alfred Buses, because someone sidled up to me in 1990 and said, "I know where 708 is." That took us across the Irish Sea to Craignas Pidorg in County Wicklow, to Jimmy Glynn's area, I won't call it a depot, but place where his buses were, and there in a field with a lot of other old buses was our 708. And of course we fell in love with it, and of course we bought it, and it was brought back to England. It was such a big job, and 494 had landed more or less at the same time, that we simply laid it aside for a lot of years. It was only really in the 2000s, at the beginning of the 2000s, that fixing the Olympic became a realistic ambition. What an ambition, because the team at FOCAB took on its biggest challenge, and together they actually reconstructed this vehicle more or less to original specification, using every trick in the book, and what they produced by 2012 was a complete running Leyland Olympic HR40, the small narrow version, very rare in anybody's terms. It was raring to go. And how lucky we were to have that vehicle, a most unusual specimen, and I won't say it was a nice thing to drive, because it wasn't, but it was a great fun to have in our collection, and a really key part of the King Alfred fleet. We've had it for 10 years, it's done a lot for us. We thought that we'd have it for as long as we've got the rest of the fleet, or however long that is. But of course, the events of the night of the 8th of December meant that it was burnt. It was involved in what looks like it's the biggest bus fire in the preservation world in the UK ever. And that's nothing to be pleased with. On the contrary, our vehicle, all that time, all that love, all that effort has been reduced to a mangled, twisted, burnt wreck. And every time I look at the pictures, I went and looked at the real thing, I think what a waste of energy and time and love and care that was. But we don't know what the future has, and we'll see how we can assess the remnants and what's to be done. That's all for the future. For the moment, we have our memories, we have our films, we have our pictures, and we have the rest of our fleet. The Friends of King Alfred Buses carries on as ever.